Welcome back to the Discovering Needs e-learning course. We started off in Lecture 1 talking about what are needs and what are needs assessments. In Lecture 2, we then developed a strategic framework for designing a successful needs assessment. Now here in Lecture 3, we'll talk about what are the tools and techniques that you can use in order to collect valuable information and guide decisions through your needs assessment. As you'll recall from Lecture 2, we're using a basic 5-step management approach for guiding our needs assessment. In Lecture 2, we looked at how do you define and design your needs assessment. And now in Lecture 3, we'll talk about how do you develop the tools for doing the needs assessment, a little bit about how you do it, and how you document the results of your needs assessment and make those valuable recommendations. Successful needs assessments do several things. They start out by measuring needs, and we look at data and objective sources of information to help us better understand what those needs are and what the gaps are in the results. And we can measure those gaps, which adds a lot of value to our decision making. Needs assessments also are used to complement supply and demand-driven decisions. We'll consider assets and the things that are already working well within our organizations as we do our needs assessment. We'll also ask why, quite often throughout our needs assessment. Why is a very important question. Why is it that we want to accomplish one result in order to get another result? Why is it that we're currently getting the results that we're currently getting? Why do we think one solution might get us better results than another solution? So you'll ask why a lot throughout your needs assessment. Needs assessments that are successful compare alternatives. We try not to get locked into any solution early in our needs assessment. Research shows us that the longer we can put off deciding on what we're going to do till we fully understand what it is we're trying to accomplish, the more likely we are to accomplish those results in the long run. We'll try to make data-based recommendations by using the needs assessment data to guide our decisions. And lastly, we'll inform decisions by carefully documenting what we learned and writing reports and recommendations that will make sense to those who have to make decisions going forward. When we think about the tools and techniques that we use in actually conducting our needs assessment, we can think about developing tools that will help us collect information about what are the gaps in results, what type of data will verify that those gaps actually exist, how do different groups perceive those gaps, because their perceptions of the gaps are almost as important as the gaps themselves, and what could be the causal factors leading to those gaps in results. We'll also then want to develop tools and techniques that will help us make decisions. What are the tools that can help us set priorities? What are the tools that will push us to look for alternative solutions that we may not have thought of before? And then how can we actually manage the related changes as we go forward when we make the decisions? So there are lots of tools for us to consider, both about collecting information and making decisions. Here is a list of a few of them that I've come up with over the years. These are also the focus of a book published by the World Bank on how to conduct needs assessments. You'll find the link to it on the resource page for this e-learning program. In the book, we've identified each of these tools and broken it out into 5 or 6 pages about when to use it, why you would want to use it, what it can help you accomplish, and what resources can best help you implement any of these tools. We'll talk about several of them in the remainder of this lecture today, but there are many more to consider. You'll always want to be broadening your tool belt when you do needs assessments. Have lots of ideas and lots of tools that you can bring to the project so that you can complete the best assessment possible. You also want to use a mix of tools throughout the assessment. You don't want to just do interviews at all 3 phases of your needs assessment. You may do interviews and surveys in one phase. You may do nominal group technique, which is a focus group tool that we commonly use, or you may use multi-criteria analysis, which is a decision-making tool that we commonly use. So you'll want to mix and match these together to fit the needs assessment context in which you're working. A common question that we often start with is, where are we going to learn about the needs? We obviously want to learn from people who know. So we want to have people who have experience. People who are experiencing the need on a daily basis are often the best informants about what the need is and what those gaps and results are and how to prioritize them, as well as what solutions may actually help close those gaps. It's also important to look to multiple stakeholders in any needs assessment. We don't want to rely on just one person or one group's perspective of needs, but we want to get input from multiple perspectives so we can truly understand the differing dimensions of the need and then how we might be able to best help close those gaps and results. And you don't want to forget that a lot of data is already available in most organizations. So there's information in previous reports, previous needs assessments, strategic planning reports or guides that may be issued by management. There's data and information available in many sources that you'll want to use, and it can save you lots of time and hassle not to collect the data on your own. Often we do end up conducting at least some interviews in most needs assessments. There are 3 basic types of structures you can consider for your needs assessment interviews. You can do a very structured interview where each question is written down and asked exactly the same way of each interviewee. You can do an unstructured interview, which is at the other end of the continuum. You have a general idea of the questions you want to ask, but you don't necessarily ask them the same way each time, and some interviewees may get questions that other interviewees don't get. Most often we end up somewhere in the middle. We use a semi-structured interview protocol. And this gives us guiding questions, possible follow-up questions, but still gives the flexibility to the interviewer to ask questions that are unique to each interviewee. We also can use 2 different types of questions within our interview protocol. We can ask direct questions, where you ask directly about the data or information that you're trying to collect. For example, what barriers have kept you from timely procurement decisions on your projects? We can also use critical incident questions, which ask people to talk about a critical incident or event in their past where they've encountered what the question is focused on. So for example, we could ask, can you describe for me an instance when you weren't able to complete the procurement process on your project in a timely manner? This gives you a different perspective on the same question, because now you're asking the interviewee to describe a personal experience when they've encountered these barriers, rather than talking about it more generally, as they may have in the direct question. Mixing these 2 question techniques up can be very helpful in most needs assessment interviews. When conducting a needs assessment interview, there are a few considerations you should make as you're starting to get organized. Of course, you want to think about who are the interviewees, who has the information that you're trying to learn. These might be staff, managers, executives. It could be people from outside the organization, in a local NGO or nonprofit, or it could be people in a ministry role. So think about who has the information that you're trying to collect. And then spend a little time thinking about who is the appropriate person to do the interview. Who should be the interviewer? You want to create a comfortable dynamic where the interviewee feels free to share what they know about the topic. So there may be differing considerations within differing cultural and country contexts that you should consider as you think about the pairing of the interviewee to the interviewer. You will want to develop a protocol that will guide how the interview is to be done. This will help you ensure that the interviews are done consistently across interviewees, so that you're getting the same basic questions asked and information gathered. Never underestimate how long it will take to get on people's schedule to conduct interviews. You should also consider how you're going to keep records of the interviews. Sometimes it's appropriate to record an interview. Other times, it's not so appropriate. In those situations, you may want to ask a third person to sit in to take notes. It's a very difficult task to interview someone and to take notes at the same time. Lastly, think about how you're going to analyze the qualitative data that you're getting from an interview. A 60-minute interview can give you 10 to 15 pages of interview notes. That's qualitative data that has to be analyzed, themes have to be identified, trends have to be looked at, and it has to be compared to other interviews. So start early on to think about what are you going to do with all this data you're collecting. A second tool that we'll commonly use in our needs assessments are surveys. Surveys can be done in a variety of forms today. We can do online surveys, phone surveys, face-to-face surveys, mail surveys, or even combinations of these different delivery approaches. We can also change the format of our survey and make decisions around how to best get the information that we're looking to collect. Do we want to use multiple choice items, or numeric open-ended or text open-ended items? We also have to think about what types of scales we'll use. So are we going to use a scale that's agreement scale? Maybe 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. Or are we going to ask people to rank? Given a list of 10 items, which 3 would you rank as most important? Or are we going to use a frequency scale? How many times in the last year have you used the procurement process? Each of these will provide you with different information. Sometimes it's more valuable to have information in one scale over the other. So you should be aware of your options and use the one that is most appropriate. It's important to remember too that when you're collecting survey data, you're collecting information about people's perspectives. So if you use an agreement scale with 1 strongly disagree and 5 strongly agree, you're getting someone's perspective on how they feel about the question that's being asked. I may rate that a 5 is a strongly agree, and you, having experienced the exact same thing, may rank it as a 4 with just an agree. Both answers are correct. There are perceptions, but they're not necessarily telling us what the reality is. In these cases, you may want to look for validating information or follow up with a frequency scale that then you can actually look to see, did the person do it the number of times that they said they did it? So you can supplement this with actual performance data. Just because it's quantitative, and you're assigning it a number 1 through 5, doesn't mean that it's necessarily verified, valid data. The last consideration we'll talk about in designing the survey is what is the sample or population? So the sample is the number of people within the larger population that you have to collect information from to be confident that you have an accurate reflection of how the whole population feels about the issue. Typically, we aim for getting about 50% of the participants, our sample, to participate in any survey. This means that if we want to have 100 people participate in our survey, and we know that only about up to 50% will actually participate, we may have to have a sample of 200 in order to get those 100 valid results. And then we could infer the information from that survey to a larger population of, let's say, 500 or 600 people within the institution. There are many online tools and resources that can help you make decisions about sample size and how those sampling decisions relate to the population that you're interested in. In thinking about writing survey questions, we often want to use a backwards design process. So as you start to write specific questions within your survey, think about what information you require and then try to write the question that will get you that information. You also want to avoid double negatives. So don't use the word not twice in a survey question. This is not what they thought would not be the solution. That can be very confusing. Also, avoid the word and. Typically, if you use the word and, you're actually asking two questions, not one question. So if you see and creeping into your questions, go back and ask, could someone actually answer the question and tell you information about both things, or are they only going to tell you information about one of those two things? Your survey questions should be written for common understanding. Anyone who takes the survey should understand what the question is. So don't try to impress your participants by using big words. Write it at a level of language that they'll understand. Avoid acronyms. Acronyms can be confusing. People may not know what they stand for. And try not to write leading questions, where people might answer in a way that they think you want to hear. Especially if the survey is going to be sent out by management or leadership in your organization, people may think that they want to hear certain results. So you want to write the question that doesn't lead them in that direction. Now is probably a good time for another self-reflection activity. I'll ask you to pause the video and write down a need, a gap in results, within your work in your organization. This can be a need that you've used in previous activities, or it can be a new need that you're just now thinking about. For that need, I want you to write down 3 interview or survey questions that you could ask staff in your organization about the need. These should be specific questions that you could actually ask somebody, and they should be related closely to the need that you've identified. After you've written down the 3 questions, I want you to reflect on how will the answers to these questions help you better understand the needs, both in terms of the current level of results and the desired level of results. And I also want you to think about, other than the staff, who else could help you better understand these needs? Are there other stakeholders that you should also be interviewing or surveying as part of your needs assessment? After you've completed the activity, we'll continue on with Lecture 3.